It presupposes that magicians have some sort of duty to do magic, which is clearly nonsense. You would not, I imagine, suggest that it is the task of botanists to devise more flowers, or that astronomers should labour to rearrange the stars? Magicians, Mr. Secundus, study magic, which was done long ago. Why should anyone expect more? An elderly gentleman, with faint blue eyes and faintly coloured clothes, called either Hart or Hunt, Mr. Secundus could never quite catch the name, faintly said that it did not matter in the least whether anybody expected it or not. A gentleman could not do magic. Magic was what street sorcerers pretended to do in order to rob children of their pennies. Magic, in the practical sense, was much fallen off. It had low connections. It was the bosom companion of unshaven faces, gypsies, housebreakers, the frequenter of dingy rooms with dirty yellow curtains. Oh, no, a gentleman could not do magic. A gentleman might study the history of magic. Nothing could be nobler, but he could not do any. The elderly gentleman looked with faint fatherly eyes at Mr. Secundus, and said that he hoped Mr. Secundus had not been trying to cast spells. Mr. Secundus blushed. But the famous magician's maxim held true. Two magicians, in this case Dr. Foxcastle and Mr. Hunt, or Hart, could not agree without two more thinking the exact opposite. Several of the gentlemen began to discover that they were entirely of Mr. Secundus's opinion, and that no question in all of magical scholarship could be so important as this one. Chief among Mr. Secundus's supporters was a gentleman called Honeyfoot, a pleasant, friendly sort of man of 55, with a red face and grey hair. As the exchanges became more bitter, and Dr. Foxcastle grew in sarcasm towards Mr. Secundus, Mr. Honeyfoot turned to him several times and whispered such comfort as, "Do not mind them, sir. I am entirely of your opinion." And, "You're quite right, sir. Do not let them sway you." And, "You've hit upon it. Indeed you have, sir. It was the want of the right question which held us back before. Now that you are come, we shall do great things." Such kind words as these did not fail to find a grateful listener in John Secundus, whose shock showed clearly in his face. "I fear that I have made myself disagreeable," he whispered to Mr. Honeyfoot. "That was not my intention. I had hoped for these gentlemen's good opinion." At first, Mr. Secundus was inclined to be downcast, but a particularly spiteful outburst from Dr. Foxcastle roused him to a little indignation. "That gentleman," said Dr. Foxcastle, fixing Mr. Secundus with a cold stare, "seems determined that we should share in the unhappy fate of the Society of Manchester magicians." Mr. Secundus inclined his head towards Mr. Honeyfoot and said, "I had not expected to find the magicians of Yorkshire quite so obstinate. If magic does not have friends in Yorkshire, where may we find them?" Mr. Honeyfoot's kindness to Mr. Secundus did not end with that evening. He invited Mr. Secundus to his house in High Petergate to eat a good dinner in company with Mrs. Honeyfoot and her 3 pretty daughters, which Mr. Secundus, who was a single gentleman and not rich, was glad to do. After dinner, Miss Honeyfoot played the pianoforte, and Miss Jane sang in Italian. The next day, Mrs. Honeyfoot told her husband that John Secundus was exactly what a gentleman should be, but she feared he would never profit by it, for it was not the fashion to be modest and quiet and kind-hearted. The intimacy between the two gentlemen advanced very rapidly. Soon Mr. Secundus was spending 2 or 3 evenings out of every 7 at the house in High Petergate. Once there was quite a crowd of young people present, which naturally led to dancing. It was all very delightful, but often Mr. Honeyfoot and Mr. Secundus would slip away to discuss the one thing which really interested both of them. Why was there no more magic done in England? But talk as they would, often till 2 or 3 in the morning, they came no nearer to an answer, and perhaps this was not so very remarkable, for all sorts of magicians and antiquarians and scholars have been asking the same question for rather more than 200 years. Mr. Honeyfoot was a tall, cheerful, smiling gentleman with a great deal of energy, who always liked to be doing or planning something, rarely thinking to inquire whether that something were to the purpose. The present task put him very much in mind of the great medieval magicians. Footnote 2. More properly called